see that reinforcement rib that is cast into the housing. That feature there was only found on the early produced Willys Jeeps. The Jeep chassis that's sitting behind me here is from a 1946 CJ2A. This particular 2A is one of 400 or so Jeeps that were made in early 46. These Jeeps did not even really be known to exist up to probably 3 to 4 years ago. It wasn't understood that they were actually production Jeeps. At the end of the war, Willys' frame producer, which was Midland Steel, was producing the last contract. When the war came to an end and the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the government then terminated those contracts. Well, it turned out in that case that Midland Steel was already partially into that contract of building these frames. And these frames ended up at Willys Overland in Toledo in their yard. And this is purely speculation on my part. I mean, I don't have any documentation to prove this out other than just knowing the history of Willys and what happened and the wartime mentality and how things were done. So at some point later in 45, I suspect they get a phone call from the government telling them that, listen, we're not going to need those frames, they're yours. You can do with them whatever you want. This frame was not obviously compatible with a 2A production Jeep. At that point, they were trying to figure out with their engineers, can we use this frame in our 2A production? And the answer was, we can, but we need to make around 22 modifications to this Jeep frame to actually fit it under a 2A. The numbers are somewhere in the 400 and so range on these Jeeps, which makes them essentially the rarest CJ2As ever made. And for years, we believe that probably people that ended up with these Jeeps assumed that they were Jeeps that had been modified, that, you know, the frame got broken or something happened to it. Starting on this side here, driven by the fact that we're now putting a T90 transmission in a World War II frame, and a T90 transmission is 1 inch longer and 1 inch taller. So these brackets on a World War II frame therefore had to be actually broken from the frame. They were riveted on, slid back 1 inch, re-welded, and they had to put a reinforcement plate back here too, because when it slid back, it actually came off these plates that were underneath to support it. And then in addition to that, they added these legs that gave it 1 inch more down to match the cross member. Now, interestingly, and I don't know why they did this, but I guess there again were trying to use every part they could. They could have easily just used the cross member from the 2A, because that would have been a bolt-in part, and they wouldn't have had to modify it at all. With regards to a spacer they had to put here for the transfer case. But I guess they decided, there again, we have it, we'll use it. So they ended up putting a spacer on this, and they added the legs. And if they hadn't done that, it would have been a direct bolt up without doing the legs and the spacer, but that's not the decision they made, and they put the spacer and the legs. So, and it's very distinct, you know, when you see it, you can't miss it, because you'll never see anything done like that on another CJ. Then going back here, obviously this is the machine gun mount that was on the World War II frame, but the floor shape on a World War II had a bump out in it, which encompassed that mount plate, and obviously a CJ floor is straight across. So this had to be torch cut off, and literally that's just what it was. It's not pretty. They just took a torch and cut the plate off and these gussets here, and just enough to get the clearance that they needed. Moving back from that modification, the next were the shock absorbers. And the shock absorbers on a World War II Jeep, and you can see the remains of the pieces here, were straight up and down. 2As, they slid the shocks forward for multiple reasons. It was a better geometry, but it also got rid of penetrating the floor of the Jeep. The World War II Jeep had a box here for this shock to live inside of. So your floor was encumbered by this box. So by sliding the angle of the shocks forward, now your floor is on plane and completely unimpeded on the entire surface. So yeah, these brackets are actually different than the original ones. They must have made these up. And then they put a boxing on the inside of the frame, so it was stable. On the front of the frame, the most significant modification they had to make was related to steering. So an MB frame had an axle, Model 25 axle, that had the steering bell crank pin on the actual axle tube. Now, they realized after the war that that design was not advantageous for a lot of reasons. One in particular was brake input steering changes with the axle design. So they decided to move the bracket up to the steering tube. So this bracket here, which holds the bell crank, had to be welded on to this tube for the correct location, as in all standard 2As. In addition to that, an MB grill, if you look at the front of the grill comes out and has a bump out right in the middle. And on a CJ grill, it's completely flat across. So this bracket here on an MB was much longer, therefore had to be chopped off, and sort of this hole was enlarged. Those are the two modifications at the front of the frame. They probably also added these spacer tubes because an MB had a wood insert here and was a reinforcement. The 2A gets a heavier duty bumper, no wood insert, and therefore these additional spacer sleeves had to be added here on the inside of the gussets. They had a ready available labor source with returning GIs, and the skills required to make the conversion were not super technical. It could basically be done with a cutting torch and a stick welder. Once the modifications were made, they stopped the line and inserted these modified frames into production, ran that production until those were done, stopped production again, reinserted the original 2A frame back into production. Of course, on a World War II Jeep, there was an additional well that accommodated the gas tank that was larger on a World War II. It was a 15-gallon, and the CJ just has a flat bottom tank that's a 10-gallon. So the MB had mounts that were inboard to accommodate that well. Well, obviously that had to be modified for this application, so the rivets that were inside here holding those on were just cut off. The brackets were moved to the outside. There again, no rivets were involved. They just welded down the sides and welded up the rivet holes to move those to the new location. At the rear of the Jeep, you've got a number of things that were done. This is the original factory gusset from the MB, but knowing that the frame was done in not as heavy a steel, because the war Jeeps were definitely much more interested in keeping the weight down as much as they could within reason. The 2A production Jeeps were going to be used for farm and multi-purpose applications for whatever utilitarian purposes they needed for as the CJs evolved. And of course they ultimately had hundreds and hundreds of accessories and different things you could use on a 2A to use at your home, on your farm, or wherever you wanted to. So they made the frames heavier for that reason. So this frame obviously is done in a lighter steel. In that same vein, the chassis on an MB had no application for a license plate. So on an original 2A, this piece here was longer and had a place for the license plate. For this, they obviously just let people drill holes and put their license plate where they wanted to. But what they did do is they added the reinforcement that all the 2As did have that helped with mounting the rear PTO setup. And in addition, obviously an MB did not have a hole for a PTO, so this hole had to be added, which mirrored the reinforcement on the inside here. The modifications that were made they don't look like they're production. They look like kind of, they were done by somebody, a shade tree mechanic. The welds aren't particularly pretty. The way they did it, there's no riveting of the parts that they took off to put back on. It's all pretty rudimentary modifications. So you could see why somebody might think, oh, well, this was actually not done in a factory. There's no way this was done in a factory, when in fact it had been. This particular Jeep belongs to a customer of mine. Brandon bought this Jeep from a gentleman out west. It had lived on a ranch. It didn't have much rust to speak of. It had some rust, but mostly it was issues related to bumps and banging around on a ranch for 30, 40 years, whatever. So the Jeep saw a lot of stress cracking and damage because of all that pounding it took over that time. When we finally got the thing completely disassembled down to a bare chassis, we realized very quickly that the frame was not savable. It had been repaired and cracked and repaired, and the areas that even hadn't been repaired yet had stress cracks that were coming and would continue to crack in other places. So at that point, the challenge became to find an actual late war frame that would have been of the same time frame that they pulled this frame out of production for, or that was part of that contract. And that was not easy because late MB frames are quite particular. The standard frames that were built during the war have a lot of things in common, but when you get to late war production frames, there's a lot of changes that did occur. And so actually trying to find a late war frame that was not in bad condition or rusted or cracked or all the above was actually quite a challenge. And it took some months to finally track one down, and then it took some time to actually get this frame out of this person's yard because of snow conditions, and there was a lot of other logistical things that went into it. But we finally got the frame, and then basically taking that frame next to the original one and basically mirroring exactly those 22 modifications to this original MB frame to recreate essentially the identical frame that would have come under this Jeep. And in some cases, we actually used the original parts that were on. We just stole them off that frame and welded them back on, or placed them back on this frame, so you actually have that pedigree to going back onto this frame. We actually are going to be sending this complete mechanical, rebuilt, restored chassis back to a shop in New Jersey to do the body work. That is a pasture green original body that's been restored. We'll probably set the body back on this chassis here before it gets picked up next week to go over there for completion. These tires clearly are not the tires that are correct for the Jeep at this point. They should be a non-directional 616 Goodyear tire, just like on original World War II Willys. The wheels are painted white from the old Jeep because this Jeep was yellow when it first came in. With the pasture green Jeeps, that was more of a burnt orange and had a pinstripe on it. And I believe that will be done, there again at the next stage of the final assembly of the Jeep. There really is no other civilian 2A Jeep that you could equate to what happened here with this anomaly. And I love it from just a historical standpoint because it speaks to the history and the mentality of a post-war environment where you're still thinking you were going to utilize that resource in some way if you could. I find that part fascinating.
Roll B, scene B2, take one. Mark.
Action!